Okay. Good morning, Hemshech Chaim Beis, Volume 3. We're page 1217. So what we've learned till now is the process that begins with the Ani Rishon Keser, which is Keser itself is the level of Reimamus and Isnasus, a transcendent, exalted state. Keser Malchus, the crown. And that begins the process, which then will turn into a rotzen, a desire for kingship, and revealing that transcendent state to the point that actually becomes Isnasus Ala'am, which is the activation of the king being a king over his nation, which is specifically not something that's close to him. A nation is, as it says, Am, Loshen Emamus. They're separate. You can't be a king over your own children. You're not a king over your own body. This is actually an example used, I'm going to point out in a moment, from the Likutei Torah that he cites. So a king is on Ephradim, which is indicating also the creation of another. The creation and the governing over another, which is all this process of Malchus, starting from Keser, going through the spheres, Chochma, Reshis, and Bina, that gives it shape and form, the Nekuda, and then Bina, the shape, until Malchus, which is the actual kingship, and that will become the Keser of the next world of Bria. But he also included in the macrocosm, this is Keser of Atzilus through Malchus of Atzilus into Biyah. In microcosm, in Malchus itself, you have Malchus includes these 10 spheres, starting from Keser Malchus, the Isnasus Atzmi we're just discussing, this core state of Isnasus, which first is an adornment and concealed state, then it's revealed through the coronation, through the Achtara on Rosh Hashanah, through the work from below that awakens this Isnasus. And that includes also step 2, the Rotzen, Atik and Arich, the Rotzen, to rule. And it's still not the actual ruling and governing until it's activated in Malchus, Malchus, which becomes Keser of Bria. But because there's a paradigm shift going from Atzilus to Bria, because the Melech and the Am, as I just pointed out, are very different entities. The nation is not the children of the king. They're not an extension of the king. They're specifically tachtenim. They're separate from a separate consciousness, a separate identity. So that is why the parsa comes into play. The parsa is the partition, that a partition between Atzilus and Biyah, and that partition, as it connects it to the very state of Malchus being, that Malchus is not a revealer, but Malchus is more separate and apart. Havdalah v'Helam, as he called it, Havdalah and Isalmus. So therefore, the words are Dafka Lachir Salmus Er. That's when you can have Kesel Bris. He says you do it the Salmus Zel Gufa Ideas Nasas the Bechinas Malchus. So Malchus is so-called exalted state and being removed from and higher and beyond. That itself serves the purpose of leading to the Hisalmus, the concealment of the parsa. Yeah, and here is where he cited the Maimer B'Yem Hashmini Atzeres earlier, which is in volume 2, which actually I wanted to look up. I'll look at it right now. And the Maimer Likutei Torah. Now, I want to focus on this Maimer Likutei Torah because when you look inside there, you get much more clarity of what he's discussing there. Here, there's a lengthy discussion on this topic, even more than it is here. Here it's much more summary, and there it's more at length. But before I sum that up, I just want to see one thing here. 1 second. On page 691 in volume 2, which he zeichens here, 691, Tafresh Sadik Aleph. He says like this. That's what I wanted to look up here. Okay. Some of you may remember when we learned it back then in volume 2, the discussion was that in Malchus there are 3 tzimtzumim, 3 gvuras that allow that higher state of the divine to prepare itself and prime itself to become actually the source for existence. Because you have to remember this, even a melech bas v'dam, even a king of flesh and blood, like a David HaMelech, is Mashichme Maila Gavoy Mekalam Shaul HaMelech, is a higher state than the nation. So you need the Melech to want to engage. It's like going to a great master teacher who's busy and is involved in his own learning, and you want him to become your teacher. So he needs to go down from those levels to apply himself and connect with the students. How much more so when you're talking about God, as we said with the example of the artist or the builder of a home, God is infinitely apart from everything. So for it to be logical and make sense, how does a level that's so beyond us all connect to us? So that's why Malchus is such a vital component, because Melech has both components. On one hand, it remains always removed, but on the other hand, he's ultimately becoming a king of this nation. So it's like when we say in Rosh Hashanah, we're asking God, who's beyond it all, engage with us. We want to have a relationship with you. Because he's not, as I said, he's not an equal. So Malchus is a great example in that sense, because it has both qualities. On one hand, there's a certain distance. On the other hand, he's coming closer to the nation. But all these levels that we're learning actually help us understand it well, because there's a level of isnasus that's so beyond that it's not even conscious altogether. There's when it becomes revealed a state of isnasus, of transcendent and exalted, elevated state. There's where it becomes a desire to want to relate and rule and govern over the people. And then there's the actual governance. So because of all these different levels, it's vital to understand that there's all these different so-called concealments while they're also revealing. And that is essentially the focus of the Maimer in Likutei Torah. So I looked it up in Mimona. I just want to refer to a few lines there. It's a Bolok Maimer, Bir and Bolok. And if you have a Likutei Torah, it would be worthwhile learning, in my opinion. Basically, primarily, it's on page 68D. Likutei Torah is broken into like columns. So Samach Ches Daled is the main place where this is discussed. So I looked there because I wanted to understand the parentheses better, which I'm going to review in a moment. So when you look there, he says exactly these words. It's almost word for word from here. The Ayin Beis quotes from there. He actually is comparing, interestingly, he says, Hayam Emed Alehem. That's referring to a verse where it says that tell what verse he's referring to. Yeah. Hayam Aleim Umayla. What does he say here? Hayam Emed Aleim. There he's referring to another verse, but the idea is that Yam, water, is Malchus. Malchus will become the governor or the king, Keser of Bria. So he compares, he says, how Malchus moves to Bria, he says, works through the parsa that separates between them. And I just want to refer to the actual words that he uses to describe the parsa. Just 1 second, right here. Just give me one moment. I'm just looking for the actual language I wanted to see here. Oh. There's a curtain and a divider or a separation, a partition to Natzilus and Biyah, which that causes there should not be the Gili of Atzilus Mamish Biyah, there should be some form of partition. It says the Hainu, she Atzilus Mahem, So he adds another point that the parsa also helps cause that Atzilus should remain in a state of exaltedness and above biyah. By dezanase biyah baligvul, because if it didn't happen, if Malchus in its full intensity went into biyah, you wouldn't have allowed biyah to really have an independent identity. It'd all be absorbed in the water, in the ocean, the yam of Malchus. So for it to be a balik vulu mida v'yesh v'dover nifrad, you need to have this parsa. And nevertheless, and at the same time, their primary life force comes from the yam of Malchus, the water of Malchus. So he compares it to actually the grains of sand on a beach. The chel hayam, which is a sandy beach, a sand on a beach. And that's why this chayil, on one hand, every grain of sand is a defined grain of sand, but all in total, they're like beyond counting. Like someone will say, tell me how many grains of sand there are on a beach. You say it's like beyond, it's not actually infinite, but it seems like it's infinite. Because it's a bridge, because the bridge to that is Malchus. So Malchus is both withholding, and there's a parsa that separates, but there's also something from Malchus that's generating and transmitting into biyah. And he goes on to say that's why the grains of sand on a beach are very dry, because the water sucks out their moisture, as opposed to, let's say, a piece of land that has its own moisture and is not dry like the grainy sands of a beach. But that's a little more of an aside, just interesting context there. So that's essentially what he says here. And he goes on to speak about Malchus and Isnasus. So basically, I said before 64D, 64C and D. Samach Ches Amid Gimel and Amid Daled. Okay. But the reason I'm pointing this out is because there are more words here that help us understand this transition from Malchus to Biyah.
This is the Pashas Balak, right?
Yes, it is. Okay. Just want to see if there's any other line I wanted to quote from here. Yeah. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to quote. He says, "Ube'emes sherish hamosachu pargud, va'pargud." The root of the parsa, basically of the partition, nimshech memokim gevayim ma'ed, comes from a very high level, and from the makifim alyenim chayachid ma'mekelim, and in it is revealed the power of Kol Yachol, God's ability to create gvul from bli gvul. So I just wanted to add that. That's on the bottom of page 60, Samach Ches Daled. Okay. So basically, one more thing that I'd like to add, he says that in Atzilus, the kav v'chut, that ray of energy that came after the Tzimtzum radiates in full intensity. That's why Atzilus is united with the divine. When it comes to Malchus, we now need to bring it to the next level, that there should be something that's separate, a separate independent consciousness. So that's like the sand that I just mentioned. That is going to be Biyah. In between is the Parsa and Malchus and the Parsa that do concealing, as well as also remaining some relationship. Because it cannot be that if it's completely disconnected, it's also not going to have an ability to connect again. So therefore, you need to have those in-between state, that in-between state. Now, when you read the mimer there, we talked about the parentheses that comes after the Likutei Torah, Bir de Mimona, which I just summed up. He says, "Hamuven sham da kavana b'chinas malchus k'shei b'chinas tzilus b'chinas isnasus atzmi." Now, the Alter Rebbe does not use the word isnasus atzmi. I did not see that expression, but it's clear that the Rebbe Rashab does see it there, because apparently, because Malchus in Atzilus is still in a very high state, because it's not yet gone through the concealment in relation to the lower levels. So the Rebbe Rashab sees that as isnasus atzmi. So that we just have to accept as a given. As I said again, when I looked at it on my surface level, I didn't see those words, but the teichen you could definitely say is that. And the Rebbe Rashab says it explicitly. He doesn't even say mashma. He says hamuven sham. So then that poses the question. So what's going on with the issue of Isalmus? So I'm going to go over the two answers that he gives in the parentheses. Then I'll stop if anybody has any questions, and then we'll continue on. So I'm going over what we learned yesterday. So he says, which means Malchus and Atzilus that he says here. The way it's in Atzilus carries that isnasus atzmi that is about something that's on a core level and not something that's subject to revelation or concealment. So since it's on that core level, that it's just beyond everything, so it's not a state of, it's not subject to concealment. So how do you associate it with the parsa and with the concealment that will go through when it relates to to the levels that are below Malchus, when it becomes Kesel Bria, between Atzilus and Bria? There's a Salmus the Salmus of the parsa, of the partition, and the Salmus that is also contributed to by Malchus being Havdalah, like he says, is Havdalah v'Salmus. So if you said Malchus is Isnasus Asmi, period, okay, that's its level. It's beyond everything. It reflects the divine element of being beyond existence. In other words, the Melech as he is on his own, not as he relates to anything. And even that may be Isnasus Atzmi, but even before it's revealed, perhaps. Actually, you have to say that before it's revealed, because that's part of the answer. So why do we associate that with the Isalmus in the context of like the Oyer going through diminishment? We're not talking about Oyer now, we're talking about Atzmi. Okay, so his answer, two answers. Well, first, before we get the answer, he says, meaning only the fact that he's removed from it all, so he's fundamentally in a concealed state, but not because something was revealed and is being concealed. So essentially, it's the question of how the Atzmi, Isnasus Atzmi, relates to where you talk about revelation and concealment. In different words, you can say the following. I said it yesterday, I'll say it again. You can have a relationship with your teacher, or with a melech for that matter, but only in context of the melech's revelations to you. Meaning, not with his core essence, but with the fact that he's revealing himself as your leader, as your king. You subject yourself to him, and he in turn commands you or gives you guidance, gives you orders, and so on. Same thing with the teacher. You relate to the teacher as he's teaching to you. And there, you could say it's subject to revelations and concealments, because there could be a little more gilui, there could be less gilui. In overall, you need to have certain helam, because the king and the am, the melech and the am, are not at the same level, so there's some concealment where the king is, you don't know what the king is really like, so there's concealment. But there's also the aspect that he's your king, so he relates to you. But his etzem, which is beyond concealment and revelation, what relationship do you have with him? I'm not saying the Rebbe Rashab is asking the question in those terms. I'm just applying that to carry it over, that it just what Rebbe Rashab is asking also leads to this bigger question. Now, it could be he's also alluding to it. In the words of the Rebbe Rashab, just back to the Maimer, is that there's only the Salmus Ba'atzme, but not a form of concealed from something else. So how do we associate these two? On one hand, Malchus is Nasas Atzmi, and on the other hand, we say it's connected to revelation and concealment. So the first answer, which I believe we reviewed pretty well yesterday, but I'll say it again. It's always good to go over again. I'll read it inside, then I'll explain. Yesh lemer, the beginnis Malchus liyesh zeu is galus dis Nasas Atzmi kanal. Shaykh bezeh salmus shamaylim. Since Malchus is not pure Hisnasis Atzmi, but is the Isgalus of Hisnasis Atzmi. Remember, Malchus came after Keser Malchus, which included Atik and Arich, which revealed the Hisnasis. In other words, it came into some form of manifestation. It's not just, it remains in a state that's beyond revelation and concealment. That itself, that Atzmi has come into some manifestation, like he said in the previous page. I'll read it exactly inside so we see it clearly. The level of Isgalus is not this. Let me see here. That it's possible that it shouldn't be revealed. Just 1 second. Yeah. Because everything that's a manefesh, as he says. But Keser Malchus is when it gets revealed. It begins he senses it, it's conscious of it. In the context of the divine, it's manifested in a state of awareness. Then comes the Rotzen Limlich, that's the second state. So we see that, and then comes Malchus Sheba Malchus, like he says, where he comes down all the way to the point where it comes ready to create, both in general terms and in specific, through the Oisius and Serufim. So we see from this that Malchus is not the state of Isnasus Atzmi beyond at all. It's a revelation of that state. So since it's a revelation, that's why Shaykh B'zei Salma Shamaylim. That's why, and it is possible, it's capable of going to a state of concealment in relation to the lower levels. That's answer number one. Okay, which is a very basic and obvious answer if you really think about it. But that's what he answers. Gam yesh lemer. Additionally, we can say, Shamaylim ala keches. When we say that Malchus is concealing something, it's not necessarily talking about concealing. Let me rephrase that. That means it's concealing the higher faculties. Hakeches sheina iris v'gelim shemesalmin ba'etzem. In other words, when you get to the state of Malchus, the Chesed and Gvura that we spoke about earlier, which reveals more about the individual, that is all being concealed because that's all receding into the Etzem. Remember, we learned on page 1214, he said, why is it that the Savos has to be through Malchus Tafke, V'loi Meshari Hamidus? Because the Shari Hamidus are all in the state of Kiruv. They reveal. First of all, they reveal the source. Gilui ma nefesh, and second of all, they're in a state of kiruv to whatever they have to be with. In the Kutei Torah, he actually says the following words. He says, Ava can be also with someone that's close to you. Like you could have Ava to your child, to your friend, to a brother, to a sister. Melech, Malchus, is not capable to someone that's your brother or sister or your children. Malchus is specifically on someone outside of you. That means that Malchus is a concealer of who you really are, because Ava reveals who you are, and it's in a state of closeness too. Since it's a state of closeness, it cannot be a creator of another entity, of a different consciousness, of a different being. So Malchus, on the other hand, has that capacity because Malchus is not in a state of kiruv. It's in a state of richuk. That's what he said back on page 1214. So therefore, from that perspective, Malchus is concealing something. It's concealing the higher faculties of the Melech, where you don't see his wisdom, you don't see his emotions, you just know Melech Malchus, Melech Shmei Nikra Lehem. You know he's your king. You know he's your authority. You don't necessarily understand who he is or have a feeling of having a emotional relationship with him as an equal. So as such, he's saying it conceals the keiches, mailim ala keiches in edus vagilim shemesalm ba'etzem. What means mesalm ba'etzem? Because they're receding when the melech is now being king and leading the country, even though he's using his mind and his emotions in how to govern, but from the point of view of the nation, of the people, they don't see that. It's not about him teaching or expressing emotions, it's about him being melech, his nasus. So that's, in that sense, the isnasus of Malchus does conceal. And that's the answer. So even though, yes, it's isnasus atzmi, but number one, it's in a state of gilui and therefore subject to concealment. That in other words, it could become concealed. A second thing, it's actually concealing the higher levels. So I would say answer 2 is an extension of answer 1, really. It's not a contradiction. It's not like 2 completely different answers. Or maybe it is. I see them as both complementing each other.
It is an extension. Otherwise, you don't understand it. Because by Helem Atzmi from the Eibishter, you cannot say it's Mailim ala Keifes of Nemiyim. But here, because it's a Isgalus, you could say it.
Okay, that's fine. That's acceptable, yeah. And he now compares it like it says elsewhere. So the teva meichin the godless, we said, someone who has a very powerful mind, has the power la'akiv ba'atzmei to control himself from not allowing something to be revealed, because that meichin is fundamentally apart from everything. See, it's interesting, he's used an example from meichin and Malchus, that meichin, because of its power, because it's removed, that's why it has ability to conceal, to cover up. Now, what does this add to what he said before? It means because the person has a meichin negalus, so what can he do? He can control his emotions. Someone that's not so powerful mind, when he's emotional, you see it. Or sometimes he can't even control it. But a person who has meichin negalus has the ability of self-control that's very powerful. Why? Because meichin negalus is in a state of being removed. So he's comparing it to Malchus now. So even though isnasus atzmi itself is beyond Gilead and Hela, we've established that. In the first point of the answer, he said it's coming in a revealed state, but it's still in a state of isnasus. And because of the state of isnasus, it has a certain state of being removed, like the moichin de gadlus. And that's why it can control and conceal the emotions or the higher faculties of the giluyim of Atzilus. So what does the second point add over the first? I'll tell you what it adds. In the first Yeshleimer is the concealment of the parsa from going from the Oir of Atzilus to be concealed and limited as it flows into Biyah, into Bri Yitzir Asiyah. The second part, in continuing this theme, is the concealment of the faculties that are higher than Malchus. So you have both things going on here. It's the concealment that Malchus, that follows Malchus, and also the concealment of Malchus concealing that which is above it, which really is all part of concealment that allows Biyah to emerge. But why does the Rebbe Rashab add the second point? Because it adds to the concealment, because he's concealing those higher faculties, and all this not a stiritis nasasatsmi. Okay, this can still use some extra thought, but I think this is more or less the points that he's making here, and I'm going to give it further thought as well. I'll share what I come up with. I want to learn the Likutei Torah again because it's very much intertwined with that. There's like an explanation.
It's really not a snasus atzmi. It's the Rebbe Rashab gave 2 options. It's not a snasus atzmi. It's a gilui of the snasus atzmi. That's why it could be malim on the yad. That's why it could be malim on the krichas shel mailo.
That's the first answer for sure. Yes. The second answer, is not contradicting that, because if, like you said, if it remains isnasus atzmi, it shouldn't be subject to helam. I think what he's adding is that Malchus. Look, Malchus is a mechanism. It's basically an instrument of God's. What Malchus does is very relevant to the process of creation. He's trying to explain how Malchus carries isnasus atzmi, but at the same time also serves as a filter that conceals. That's really what he's explaining here. And that concealment is what he discussed here. So since it says galus of isnasus atzmi, correct? It's therefore can then be masalim dover, like he says, ha'isal mashamaylim, and in addition, the helam that it causes over, that it's able to, it's almost like saying because of his isnasus atzmi, he therefore is able to conceal his faculties, ma'akav atzmi, the eris and giluim.
He's carrying also the kreifos, apnimiyim, but he is malim them.
Yeah,
because the bottom line, Malchus is mekabel from all of them.
Yeah, remember also Malchus is like Levona, it's the darg of Ein Oid. Malchus is Moshe Shenatzmus. So that's a vital component. But one second, let me just think one thing here, what I just thought. You could say that the second explanation may be Isnasus Atzmi, because Isnasus Atzmi, that's why he can conceal his faculties. That may be a different way of explaining the second answer. Let me throw that out there just as a thought. You could say that the second answer is not building on the first answer. It's a different answer. That Malchus is takis nasis atzmi. And then it's not subject to concealment. But being that it's nasis atzmi, like Moichem de Gadlus, it has the ability to suppress its giluyim, basically. So it's not because it's subject to helam, it just has a power. It's like a chochem, the Moichem de Gadlus, has the power to conceal his giluyim.
That means that he's having a shaykhs to them. The helam atzmi, the isnasus atzmi has no shaykhs to them. You don't have to say even that he's having the care to suppress them.
But in this sense, it's not. It's the answer would be not because that he has a shaykhs to helam. The Eibishter has the power to stop his Eira Gvul from Eira Bligvul. Yeah, Eira Bligvul and Eira Gvul are both Eir. But because he's a Snasus Atzmi, because Bichlal completely removed, he's able to control his Giluyim. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, maybe. I have to think about it some more. Definitely not contradictory answers, but I need to think about it a little more because there's a lot of different things that could be said here. I have a sense that this is going to be understood better as we go along, because the Rebbe Rasha probably why is he saying this parentheses? He's not just coming to explain the Likutei Torah here. He's probably negated to the Havana of the whole Hemshech here. So I will reserve that when I sense from the previous style of the Rebbe Rashab that this is going to come to play. It's an understanding of Einoid in some way. In other words, where the Koyach HaHelam itself is part of the Gili, it's part of the Koyach HaLaki. You could answer. Well, no, let's not go there. Okay. I stop now with the parentheses. Anybody wants any clarification or any questions? Let's go for it.
So there are two types of, the answering is that there's two types of...
Very low, cannot hear you.
Is the answering that there's two types of helam? There's like a helam like a cover-up and a helam that of like more of self-control?
That he said even before the question, before the answers. That Isnasus Atzmi is basically Salmus Ba'atzmi, Leila Hailim Dover. And I explained yesterday that yes, the fact that something is completely removed is fundamentally in a state of concealment, but it's not concealed in context of reveal. It's just fundamentally of a different reality. That he said before. The question is, how can you speak about Malchus in a state of connected to Hisalmus through an outside concealment, that something is concealing a revelation? And that's where the two answers come into play. One, as I said, is the answer is because Malchus is, at the end of the day, is his galus, is a state of revealed isnasus atzmi. It's not just a completely removed, it's a gilui, and there you can say that something is getting concealed. Or the second answer, that is concealing the higher, the revealed faculties, the higher giluim, eres giluim, shamis almin ba'etzem. The more I think about it, the second answer, I think my last explanation is more correct. Because when I see Shemisalman by Etzem, it means it's not that the Etzem is subject to concealment. The Etzem has the power to not reveal, period. It has nothing to do with Helam and Gilui. Like he said before, that Asas Masters, he says the question was, correct. But that doesn't mean that Etzem cannot withhold or control and conceal the Giluim that come from it. It could be that's the real pshat, maybe even more. But you know what? Maybe both work hand in hand. And I need to think about it more. It sounds to me now, when he says the Salmus Etzem, means it's not that the Etzem is revealed or concealed. It means the Etzem is basically withdrawing the Esses Virus into himself, like what happened by the Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum Arishin is not a Helam on the Etzem, but there it's a Helam on the Gili. Atzmus is here, the Atzem is pulling it in. I need to think about it more. It's not clear to me 100%. Anyway, did I answer your question? I'm not sure what your question was, but did I answer whatever you were trying to clarify?
To me, it seems the answer is already in the question.
No, the answer is in the question.
In the last part of the question, you're saying that there's, I mean,
The last part of the question makes the question stronger. The answer is that it's a Gili, not a Hisalmus Ba'atzme. The answer is that Malchus is not a Hisalmus Ba'atzme. It's a Gili outward, so to speak. So therefore, it could be subject to conceal.
the whole parentheses.
Anyway, it's very low. It's very hard to hear you.
The whole
I can't really hear you.
The whole parentheses to me is a snasis atmi.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody wants to pose anything? Okay.
If it's two different answers, it's two different meanings. The first answer is that it's only a gilui from this snasis atzmoi. And if it's a second answer, then it is a snasis atzmoi.
Yeah, and Hanami, I think there's nothing wrong with saying that. It's very possible that's what he's saying. I have some questions about it. That's why I don't want to be completely definitive, because I'm thinking I might as well say it. In Ayin Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, we know when we say Tzimtzum is not Kipshute, so we say that there are four opinions on that Rebbe writes. One is it's not Kipshute in the Oyer, that there's a day that's Kipshute in the Moyer and in the Oyer. There's a day that's Kipshute only in the Oyer, not in the Moyer. Not Kipshute in the Moyer and the Oyer, and not Kipshute only in the Oyer, which this fourth day is the day of Chassidus. In other words, Tzimtzum itself means concealing something which is subject to be concealed. You can't conceal something that's not in a state of revelation. For example, you can cover up the sun, an eclipse of the sun, and you can block its light, but you can't block its very essence because it's not subject to Gili. The sun remains the sun. As a matter of fact, it may even be emitting other waves that are not through Giluim. It's not through light. You can stop its light, but you can't stop its etzem. So in that context, Tzimtzum and concealment is only possible in a state of revelation. However, the power of Tzimtzum itself doesn't come from Oyer. Who stops the Oyer has to be a koyach that's higher than Oyer. Because from the point of view of Ein Sof, it would just shine and glow everywhere. Where is this thing that's so-called withdrawing the light or receding? So that was, I think he means by an answer two, as the koyach ha'atzmi that is within Malchus. But he says, I'll just look again. Shamaylim ala keiches sheina eres raglim shemesalmin ba'etzem. The problem is the first half says Shamaylim ala keiches, that Malchus is concealing the faculties, and then he says shemesalmin ba'etzem, like the chochem who's able to control his giluyim. So that's where I'm not clear. Does he mean, is he talking about atzmi that is just able to withhold and not reveal? Which does not mean Helam and Gilui it still answers the question. It's still an atzmi that's not subject to Helam and Gili, but he has the power to withdraw the light that's coming from him. Or does he mean, like we spoke before, that he's talking about Malchus's ability to just conceal the higher faculties because Malchus is now his galus esnasis atzmi? That's the question here regarding the second explanation. I'm leaning toward the first way, that it's his galus, it's esnasis atzmi, not because of his galus, but it just has the power because the moshel of the meichin the gadlus fits with that better. Because there's the power of the meichin the gadlus to be ma'akiv, to control. Whereas in the second explanation, or the first explanation, that it's hisnasis begilui, then the question is, why is he bringing the meichin? What does the meichin the akiv have to do with it? Even though you could explain it. I don't know if anybody's following me, but this is what I'm debating in my mind, how to understand the second half. But again, by me, the biggest question is, why do we need this parentheses?
I am following you. I'm not convinced that you're right. I'm not convinced that you're wrong also.
I said that myself. I said myself that it's not definitive. I'm trying to weigh the two. It's not 100% clear here. That's why I suggest that it may come clearer in the continuing pages, where maybe we'll see why the Rebbe Rashab brought this. It's fine. Listen, we're discussing it. It could be open for interpretation. I don't have a definitive conclusion. No.
Dafke the marshal from Gadlus HaMeichin, I think, is showing the opposite. Because if you want to say that there is the Koichas and you are malim, that means there is something already there. By Hisnasus Atzmi, there is nothing. But Gadlus HaMeichin is showing you that it's not there.
No. It's your point is well taken. I agree with what you're saying. That's why Gadlus HaMeichin can be used both ways. It's true. It's not. Look, I want to read it again. Maybe over Shabbos, I'll a little more time. We'll read it. We'll get there. So we have on the table a few options, and that's fine. It's like two ways to learn the Gemara: Teisvis and Rashi. And we'll see. And the contrary, but anybody has thoughts on this, perfectly welcome to throw in. I think it's vital to look in Likutei Torah because this is an explanation in Likutei Torah. So I think also looking there closely could help understand this. But I have to go back there and see. And again, what's pushing me a lot is, why is the Rebbe Rashab negay here to say this? Why is it negay? He's not just coming on Hagah and Likutei Torah. There's something more going on. But okay, fine. Let me just read the line afterward, the parentheses. V'hainu, the b'chinas isnasus atzmi, the b'chinas keser malchus, ayidei zed dafke nasa b'chinas atzimtzum v'arichuk, sheyuchel liyas abriya ma'ayin liyesh, b'chinas malchus shabamalchus. So here it clearly states, so the isnasus atzmi of keser malchus, dafke through that comes the tzimtzum, the concealment and the distance, in order to create Bria Yesh Ma'ayin Liyesh. So I think when you read this line after the parentheses, you understand some of what the parentheses was coming to tell us. Because we want to have Bria Yesh Ma'ayin Liyesh of a Nivra that's Nifrad and separate from Malchus. Like a Melech al Am, al Nifradim, al Zorim, on strangers. As such, he's saying that this Nasas Atzmi of Keser Malchus becomes a tzimtzum. But his question was, this Nasas Atzmi is not subject to tzimtzum. So the first answer was, because we're talking about this galus of his Nasas Atzmi. And the second answer, either way we explain it, he's basically saying that Keser Malchus does have the ability to conceal. Either we're talking about the concealing of the higher faculties as an extension of answer number one, or it's the Atzmizdika power to create tzimtzum, not because Atzmus is subject to tzimtzum, but because he has the power to conceal. And that power is transferred into Malchus that allows that concealment. So really, this line does not help us clarify the answer number two, because you could use it either way. But I am leaning, because you say Malchus is the, let's say, the Keser Malchus is Nasus Atzmi, and here he doesn't say his galus is Nasus Atzmi. Interesting, Rav Shlomi, you see? Al yidei zeh dafka nasa b'chinas hatzimtzum v'harichuk. B'chinas Malchus Malchus. Okay, it's a deep concept. This is straight from the Likutei Torah, by the way. These lines.
The second answer is not the Galus. Second answer that this is Isnasas Atzmi.
Right, that Isnasas Atzmi has the koyach to be mailim and create yesh mayim, basically.
And the Gadlus Samechen is a very important muscle.
I know, and it can go different ways. I will give it some thought. And okay, good. I'm going to stop here unless somebody has any questions. It's definitely a deep union here. Gili, that's no questions. Everybody fine? Okay. So we'll stop here. A few lines after the parentheses are on.